The bottle was already on the table when Faye Birch noticed it. She had been making her way around the room. The Meridian Realty Annual Client Appreciation Gala, held every November in the Sable Room on the 42nd floor of the Dempsey Tower in downtown Toronto, doing what she always did at these events, which was move in a slow, purposeful orbit through the highest value clusters of people. Clients, developers, portfolio managers, the ones whose names appeared at the top of the commission ledgers. She had been in the middle of a sentence when her eyes went sideways to the drinks table and found a half bottle of wine sitting between a tray of canapes and a decorative pine arrangement. It was small. The label was cream-colored with a simple crest and the kind of modest typography that made no effort to impress. It was the sort of thing you would see tucked on a lower shelf in a grocery store or left over from somebody's housewarming 2 seasons ago. And standing perhaps 2 feet away from it, with his hands clasped in front of him and a glass of sparkling water in one of them, was the man she had spent the last 3 weeks wishing would simply stop showing up. She crossed the room. She picked up the bottle without asking anyone's permission, which was the way Faye Birch moved through all spaces she considered her own, and she turned it to face the nearest cluster of people. "Is this yours?" she asked, and she said it with the precise calibration of someone who knows the answer is yes and wants the room to know it before the person answers. Calvin Stroud said that it was. Faye looked at him for a moment the way people look at a piece of furniture placed incorrectly in a room. Then she held the bottle higher, toward the chandelier light, and she let her voice carry. "You brought an ice wine from a winery I've never heard of," she said, "to a client gala where we have 140 people and a full bar." The conversations nearest to them tapered down. "It's Enniskillen," Calvin said, "the 2003 Vidal. I know what it says on the label." "Then you know it won the Grand Prix d'Honneur at Vinexpo Bordeaux, first Canadian wine to win it. There were fewer than 900 bottles in the 2003 vintage." He paused. "If you turn it and look at the back seal, the lot number is pressed into the glass under the foil. That particular press mark was only used from 2002 to 2004. Faye did not turn the bottle. She looked at the room instead, which had continued to quiet around them, and she read the room the way she always read it, quickly, accurately, and entirely in terms of what it could give her. The clients were watching. The brokers were watching. Brent Sassas from the downtown sales team had already moved a half step to his left to get a cleaner angle on his phone. She set the bottle down on the edge of the table and turned fully toward Calvin Stroud. "Here's what I know," she said, and her voice had changed shape entirely, warmer, lighter pitched for an audience. "I know that tonight is one of the most important client nights we run all year. I know that the people in this room represent almost $60 million in active listings. And I know," she gestured briefly, a small wave that somehow managed to indicate all of him at once, "that a portfolio analyst who has been with this company for 3 weeks probably doesn't need to be making decisions about what gets presented at a table like this." Several people laughed, not all of them, but enough. She kept going. She talked about how the gala had a presentation standard that took months to plan. She talked about how client perception was everything in luxury real estate, and how the smallest details either reinforced the brand or quietly undermined it. She talked, and this was the part that made the room go fully still, about how someone who came to work every day in the same gray jacket, who drove a car she was fairly certain had been manufactured before some of these clients had started secondary school, and who apparently thought a half bottle of wine from Niagara was an appropriate contribution to a 42nd floor client event, was perhaps not the ideal representative of what Meridian Realty stood for. Nobody said anything. Calvin Stroud held his glass of sparkling water. When she finished, he nodded, once, slowly the way a person nods when they are not agreeing with something, but have decided that the agreement of the moment costs nothing worth keeping. He looked at the bottle on the table. He looked at Faye, and then he looked briefly at Wendell Price, who was the branch manager, and who was standing approximately 12 feet away with a drink he had stopped touching. Wendell looked back at Calvin for exactly the length of time it takes a person to decide that something is not their problem, and then he looked at the floor. Faye turned to the event coordinator, a young woman named Tara, who had been standing near the bar with a clipboard. Would you mind asking security to walk Mr. Stroud out? He came in on a guest pass, and I think the evening will go more smoothly without the distraction." Tara found Dale Corrigan from the building's security desk, who appeared in the doorway with the expression of a man trying to determine whether an emergency had actually occurred. He looked at Calvin, a man in his late 50s in a gray jacket, holding a glass of water, doing nothing, and then at Faye, and then at the 140 people who had stopped pretending not to watch. He stepped over and said quietly that he could walk Calvin to the elevator. Calvin set his glass down. He looked once more at the bottle on the table, which no one had touched since Faye set it there. Then he did something no one in the Sable room had predicted. He smiled. Not a performance of a smile, but a small, private one, the way a person smiles at a thought that belongs entirely to them. He buttoned the middle button of the gray jacket and walked with Dale Corrigan to the elevator without another word. The room went back to its drinks. Brent Salas lowered his phone. The bottle of Inniskillin 2003 sat on the edge of the table, lot number pressed into the glass under the foil, for the rest of the evening. No one looked at it. No one picked it up. By midnight, someone from catering had moved it to a shelf behind the bar, and there it stayed. Calvin Stroud had come to the Meridian Realty branch on King Street West on a Tuesday morning in early September, 3 weeks after Stroud Capital Group had completed its acquisition of the parent brokerage. He carried a messenger bag that had belonged to his son years ago, wore a badge that identified him as a portfolio analyst on secondment from the acquisitions team, and took the stairs instead of the elevator because the stairwell was quieter and he liked to hear a building before he worked in it. He was 58 years old. He had started Stroud Capital Group out of a rented office above a dry cleaner in Hamilton, Ontario, 26 years earlier, with $70,000 borrowed against a house he and his late wife, Anne, had bought the year before. The company now managed a portfolio of commercial and residential development properties worth just under $4 billion. 2 people in the world knew who he was when he walked into the Meridian Realty office that Tuesday morning. One was Alistair Cope, Stroud Capital's CFO, who had arranged the secondment documentation. The other was Calvin himself. He took a desk near the back of the open-plan floor, next to a column that blocked the natural light and across from a printer that jammed 3 times a day. He answered his phone with his first name only. He brought his lunch from home in a reusable container and ate it at his desk. For the first 4 days, the only person who spoke to him was a woman from IT who came to reset his network password. What Calvin wanted to know could not be learned from the acquisition reports. He had read those. They told him the revenue figures and the listing volumes and the staff turnover rates. They did not tell him what happened in this building when the quarterly numbers were not the thing everyone was looking at. He had made enough acquisitions in 26 years to know the difference between a company that was underperforming and a company that was being quietly poisoned from a position of authority. The numbers from the King Street branch were inconsistent in a way that suggested the second. He had 4 months before the restructuring announcement. 1 regional director chair would open. He needed to know who deserved to sit in it. Faye Birch noticed him on his 3rd day, when a leasing file that had been stalled for 6 weeks crossed his desk as part of a backlog review. The file concerned a commercial tenant who had raised a maintenance dispute that 2 senior brokers had failed to resolve. Calvin spent an evening reading the original lease, identified a clause that had been misapplied at signing, wrote a 2-paragraph summary of the issue and a proposed correction, and left it in the relevant brokers folder the next morning. The lease was settled 4 days later. In the branch newsletter that went to all staff, the resolution was credited to the commercial team's diligence and to Faye's leadership in escalating the matter appropriately. Calvin's name did not appear. He closed the newsletter and went back to work. It happened again with a straight-a compliance issue, then with a listings database that had been producing duplicate entries for 4 months and had already cost 2 clients a combined afternoon of confusion at closing. Then with a vendor dispute over commission structure that 3 managers had documented as unresolvable. Each time Calvin read the file, found the problem, left a note. Each time the fix traveled upstairs inside Faye Birch's name. Each time his name traveled nowhere. The people around him noticed the pattern before he said anything about it. because he never said anything about it. That was the part Faye found most unsettling. She had spent 6 years in the branch director chair by ensuring that the people around her were legible, their ambitions, their weaknesses, their specific hunger for advancement. She knew how to read a threat, and she knew how to neutralize it. Calvin Stroud refused to be legible. He did not campaign. He did not look at her in meetings in a way she could characterize as a challenge. He came in, sat by the column, ate his lunch, fixed things she had told her team were unfixable, and went home. By October, she had stopped seeing a temporary analyst and started seeing a problem she could not name. And problems she could not name were the only kind that genuinely frightened her. So she began the other work. She assigned him a market analysis covering 14 submarkets and wanted it in 3 business days, knowing the dataset alone would take 5. He delivered it in 2.5. She sent him to audit a property management file in Scarborough that was already known internally to be unrecoverable. He recovered it. She told him, through a carefully worded email that copied 3 other people, that his secondary market reports were not quite aligned with our client communication standards, which was a thing she said to everyone she wanted to feel uncertain, and which had never once failed to make someone uncertain. He replied that he appreciated the feedback and asked whether there was a style guide he could reference. There was not one. She never responded. The floor had absorbed her assessment of him by November without anyone deciding to absorb it. He was the gray jacket man, the one from acquisitions who nobody had asked for, who kept submitting reports that mysteriously fixed things that were already broken. Someone started calling him the auditor. It didn't catch the way nicknames usually catch, but it circulated. Jody Nasser, who sat near Calvin and had once asked him for help navigating the property management software, stopped asking. Invitations to after-work events stopped reaching him. When he walked into the kitchenette, conversations didn't exactly stop, but they shifted register, the way conversations do when someone enters a room who doesn't quite belong in it. Calvin kept a record of none of this in writing. He did his work and he let the building show him what it was. By the time the Gala arrived, he understood Meridian Realty's King Street branch completely. And what he understood did not make him angry. It made him patient and precise, and very certain about what he intended to do next. He had chosen the wine carefully. The Inniskill in 2003, Vidal had been given to him 8 years earlier by a developer in Niagara-on-the-Lake, who had shaken Calvin's hand after Calvin had declined to leverage a land dispute in his favor when he could have, when most people in his position would have. The developer had pressed the bottle into Calvin's hands and said, "There are maybe 800 people in the world who will ever hold one of these, and most of them don't deserve it." Calvin had kept it in a temperature-controlled cabinet ever since, not because of the value, but because of the story attached to it. He brought it to the Gala, because the Gala was the one night of the year when the entire branch stood in the same room without a desk between them, and he had learned long ago that what a company actually is shows itself most clearly when its people think they are relaxing. He was not trying to impress anyone. He was watching. What he watched was this. He watched 140 people see Faye Birch take a bottle off a table and perform a verdict before she had read the evidence. He watched them hear him name the winery, the vintage, the award, the lot mark pressed into the glass under the foil, and he watched not one of them take 4 steps to the table to look for themselves. The bottle was 2 feet away. The lot mark was exactly where he said it was. The truth was available to anyone who wanted it. Nobody wanted it, because wanting it meant finding out that Faye Birch was wrong, and a room full of people whose commission reviews passed through Faye Birch's desk had quietly done that arithmetic before anyone had to say it out loud. He watched Wendell Price set down his drink and decide that the evening was not his responsibility. He watched Paulette Wark from Human Resources, whose title was on the laminated card next to the emergency exit in every corridor of the building, stand with her arms folded and her face carefully arranged into something that was not quite seeing. He watched Brent Salas get the angle right on his phone. He watched Jody Nasser look away. And then he walked out, with Dale Corrigan 2 steps behind him, and the elevator doors closed, and the sounds of the Sable Room diminished to nothing. He sat in his car in the Dempsey Tower parkade for 20 minutes, not because he was hurt, The decision about what came next had been made before he left the house that evening. He sat because the parkade was quiet and the November concrete held a particular kind of stillness, and he wanted to feel the full weight of what he had just confirmed before he drove home. The clip was on Brent Salas's personal social media by 10:45, 47 seconds. Faye, the bottle held aloft, Calvin's reply. Her extended remarks about the gray jacket, the old car, the appropriate representative of what Meridian Realty stood for. The laughter that came from the bar side, Calvin's nod and his quiet exit. By morning it had been shared into 4 separate commercial real estate group chats. By Sunday a forum thread had appeared with the branch logo clearly visible in the background, and the thread had attracted over 200 replies. Someone had found a recent Terrio wine auction listing for the Enniskillen 2003 Vidal and posted the sale price. The thread went briefly quiet. Then someone said the auction price didn't necessarily apply to this particular bottle, and the thread moved on, and nobody went back to check whether anyone had actually looked at the lot. Mark pressed into the glass under the foil. Jody Nasser shared the clip on Saturday afternoon into a group of 11 colleagues. The caption was 4 words and a wine glass emoji. Faye watched the clip on Saturday evening at home. What she felt was relief, the specific relief of a person who has converted a problem into a story and managed to be the one who gets to tell it. The clip showed exactly what she wanted it to show: a regional director managing her event, her brand, her client room. She had been doing this for 6 years. The pattern had never failed her. She spent Sunday reviewing her Q4 projections and selecting the points she intended to emphasize at the restructuring announcement. By Monday morning she was composed and purposeful, and she arrived at the office 11 minutes before anyone else. The email from Stroud Capital Group's board office arrived at 9:55 Monday morning, addressed to all Meridian Realty King Street personnel. It was 5 sentences. All branch staff were required to attend a full company meeting in the ground floor presentation suite on Wednesday at 10 in the morning. Attendance was mandatory and could not be waived. The restructuring plan would be addressed. The owner of Stroud Capital Group would be present. The floor made a sound Calvin would have recognized if he had been there. A kind of suspended inhale. The sound a room makes when 80 people read the same sentence at the same moment, and each of them begins the same calculation simultaneously. Nobody at Meridian Realty had ever seen the owner of Stroud Capital Group. The company was private. The board filings showed a holding structure and a registered address in Hamilton. There was a CFO on the public record and a corporate website with no photographs. The ownership line had never given a public statement, never attended a groundbreaking, never been quoted in a commercial real estate publication in 26 years. Faye read the email 3 times and felt the anxiety convert itself, by force of habit, into strategy. The restructuring was arriving 3 months early, and it was arriving in the same week her Q4 numbers were strong, her department's summary was polished, and every significant file recovery of the past quarter was documented on paper that bore her signature. Whoever the owner was, that documentation was what they had read. She was certain of it. She spent Monday afternoon and all of Tuesday preparing. She printed her summary in 3 bound copies and chose, for Wednesday, a dark jacket that read well under presentation lighting. She did not think about the bottle, which was still sitting on a shelf behind the sable room bar on the 42nd floor, unclaimed, the lot mark intact. The presentation suite on the ground floor of the King Street building held 90 people. On Wednesday morning it was at capacity, with additional staff standing along the side wall. The leadership team took the front row. Faye Birch sat in the aisle seat with her 3 bound copies on her lap and her jacket smooth across her shoulders. Alistair Cope came in at 9:58. He was 62, silver-haired, unhurried in the particular way of a person who does not need a room's attention because he already has it. He shook Wendell Price's hand at the front of the room and said something quiet that Wendell nodded at once. Then Alistair stepped to the presentation lectern and said that the owner of Stroud Capital Group had been inside the King Street branch since the first week of September. The room took a moment. Not because the words were unclear, because the shape they made did not immediately resolve into something the room could hold. A consultant, someone said very quietly in the 3rd row, an observer, someone from the board sitting in on operations. Alistair said that the placement had been arranged personally, that the documentation had come through his own office, and that the purpose had been to assess 3 things that no acquisition report can measure: management quality, company culture, and the character of the people Stroud Capital intended to promote. He stepped back from the lectern. Calvin Stroud walked in from the side door. He was wearing a dark suit and carrying nothing, and he walked the length of the front of the room without hurrying and stopped beside the presentation screen. He looked exactly like the man who had sat beside the column for 3 months, because he was, and that was the thing that made the next 20 seconds what they were. The silence that fell on that suite was not the silence of surprise. Surprise has a sound, a sharp intake, a scraping of chairs, a murmur that builds. This was the other kind, the sound of 80 people arriving at the same understanding at the same instant, and every single one of them going completely still. Someone in the 4th row dropped a pen and did not pick it up. Brent Salas, standing at the side wall, felt the specific weight of his own phone in his jacket pocket. Jody Nasser put both hands flat on her knees. Wendell Price looked at the screen in front of him and did not look away from it. Faye Birch did not move at all. The bound copies of her Q4 summary were on her lap. The dark jacket was smooth across her shoulders, and she was looking at a man she had escorted from a client event 5 days earlier, in front of every colleague she had, because she had been certain of what he was and had never once wondered what he might be instead. Calvin said good morning, and his voice was the same voice that had named a Niagara winery in a crowded room, calm, level, carrying without effort. He said that his assessment of the King Street branch was complete. He said that the branch had real operational problems, and that every one of them was solvable, and that he had solved several of them himself from a desk beside a column, while the people responsible for them were in other meetings. He paused. He said that the assessment had also included the annual Client Appreciation Gala on the 2nd Friday of November. He asked for the footage. Alistair Cope brought it up on the presentation screen. They had not edited it. That was the decision, to show exactly what had been posted, exactly as Brent Salas had filmed it and shared it, with the caption still visible for 2 seconds before the clip began. They watched it on a screen 8 feet wide with the audio turned up, and the sound that came out of those speakers was their own evening played back to them in a room where there was nowhere comfortable to look. They watched Faye take the bottle off the table. They heard her voice fill the presentation suite, the part about the gray jacket, the old car, the appropriate representative of what Meridian Realty stood for. They watched the laughter come from the bar side and spread. They watched Calvin name the vineyard and the vintage, and the lot mark pressed into the glass, and they watched Faye cut him off without checking. And then they had to watch the 4 feet of empty space between that bottle and the nearest row of guests. The bottle sat there on the table for the full remaining duration of the clip, unexamined, the truth available to anyone willing to take 4 steps and look. Nobody did. 80 people, on a screen 8 feet wide, watched themselves decide that it was easier not to check. When it ended, the room was quiet in a way that had a texture to it. People studied their hands. People looked at the blank screen. The front row could not look at the man standing beside the lectern, and the back wall could not look at the front row. Calvin let it sit. Then he spoke. He said that what had brought him to the front of that room was not one person losing her temper at a client event. A single moment of poor judgment, he said, is an incident. Companies survive incidents. What he had watched on Friday evening was not an incident. He said the bottle had been standing on a table 2 feet from the nearest guests for the entire duration of the event. Anyone in the room could have settled the question in 30 seconds by looking at the lot mark under the foil. Nobody did, not because they couldn't, but because they had already worked out without needing to discuss it, that his being right was more expensive to them than his being humiliated. He said the clip had been shared into industry group chats by Sunday morning, with the branch logo clearly visible in the frame. He said the employee relations contact, whose name and direct line appeared on the laminated card beside every emergency exit in the building, had received no communication from King Street staff that weekend, while the clip was circulating in 11 separate internal groups. He said the branch manager had been in the room 12 feet away with the standing to end the situation in a single sentence and had made a calculation instead. He said the HR coordinator had turned her head. Then he said the thing that people at the King Street branch would still be repeating a year later. He said, "A company's culture is not visible in how it treats people when leadership is watching. It is visible in the decisions a room makes in the 30 seconds when it believes no one who matters is present." What he had come to Meridian Realty to understand was not in any file or any quarterly summary. It was in the 4 feet of space between a table and a crowd of people who had decided, unanimously and without discussion, that it was easier not to walk over. Faye Birch stood up. She had sat through all of it without moving, which had cost her something, and now she stood with one of the bound copies sliding off her lap to the floor. She said his name, not a title, just Calvin, the way she had said it across the sable room. She said she wanted to explain. She said the Gala had been a high-stakes client evening, that she had been managing optics under pressure, that her department's Q4 results were the best the branch had recorded. She said she could not allow a moment of imperfect judgment to be weighed against 5 years of results that nobody else in that building had come close to producing. Calvin listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he said she was right about the results. The numbers were real. He said the results were precisely what had allowed the situation on Friday evening to occur. Because the branch had learned, over 5 years, that a strong quarterly figure was the ceiling of what it needed to examine, and that whatever was producing that figure did not need to be looked at too carefully. He said that Stroud Capital was no longer purchasing that arrangement. Alistair Cope read the decisions from the lectern. Faye Birch was removed from her position with immediate effect for abuse of authority toward an employee, for conduct causing public harm to the organization, and for the systematic reassignment of staff work product over a documented period of 3 months. The matter would be referred to the appropriate external parties, and what followed from there would not be the company's decision. Wendell Price was removed as branch manager for failure to act on conduct he had directly witnessed. Paulette Wark was terminated for failure to perform the core function of the role whose title appeared on a posted notice in every corridor of the building. Brent Salas was terminated for filming and distributing footage of a colleague on personal social media during a company event. Jody Nasser was terminated for participating in the distribution of that footage. 11 additional staff members who had shared or commented on the clip received formal written notices that would remain on their permanent employment records. Calvin said that this was where it stopped. Employees who had stood in the sable room and said nothing would not be dismissed for standing there, because silence alone was not a firing offense, and because if it were, the room would be nearly empty. That was not the finding he had come to deliver. Dale Corrigan, who had worked security at the Dempsey Tower for 11 years and had been asked by a regional director to escort a guest to the elevator, was not disciplined. Calvin said the man had done exactly what a reasonable person does when a figure of authority gives a reasonable sounding instruction, and had done it with more care than almost anyone else in the building had shown that evening. Faye Birch was escorted from the building by 2 people from Alistair Cope's office, past every broker she had managed, through the King Street lobby with its glass front and out onto the November sidewalk. She was carrying nothing. The 3 bound copies of her Q4 summary stayed on the floor of the presentation suite, and they were recycled by facilities at the end of the day. What she stood there thinking about was not the clip and not the words at the lectern. It was the bottle, still on the shelf behind the sable room bar on the 42nd floor, the lot mark exactly where he had said it was. She had held it in her own hands. She had been 2 inches from the truth. She had decided, in a fraction of a second, that looking was a kind of losing, and she had been completely right that everyone in the room would make the same calculation. She just had not accounted for the one person in the building who already knew what was in the glass and did not need anyone else's opinion to be certain of it. Calvin stayed in Toronto through the winter. He rebuilt the commission attribution system first. Within 2 weeks of the restructuring, every deal that closed carried the name of the person who had originated it at the top of the summary page, and Calvin read those summaries himself. An analyst who had spent 18 months watching her work disappear into other people's presentations closed the branch's largest residential deal of the quarter and saw her name in the board report for the first time. She came in the following Monday and put in the best morning of her career before 8 a.m., because that is what happens when someone finally sees the record keeping honest pace with the work. Human Resources was restructured so that the reporting line no longer ended inside the branch. Calvin said in a staff meeting that a reporting system only functions when the person receiving a complaint does not report to the person the complaint names. Nobody argued with that. The promotion process was opened. Anyone in the building could apply for the regional director position, and the criteria were published in full, what Stroud Capital would measure and in what order. Competence was on the list. So was how a candidate treated people who could do nothing for them. A single line had been added at the bottom of the conduct standards document, 9 words long. Everyone in the building understood where it had come from without being told. Character is most visible when no one important appears to be watching. The bottle of Inniskillen 2003 Vidal was retrieved from the sable room shelf the Thursday after the meeting, still sealed, lot number intact under the foil. Calvin brought it home and put it back in the cabinet without ceremony. It had already done what it was supposed to do. By the following spring, when Stroud Capital ran its annual internal culture survey across its entire property portfolio, the King Street branch scored higher on trust and leadership than any office the company held. It was the highest score the survey had recorded in its 14-year history. Calvin was not in Toronto when the results came in. He was somewhere else by then, another city, another building, another desk in a back corner near a column, a badge that said something ordinary, a messenger bag that had belonged to his son years ago. He answered his phone with his first name only. He brought his lunch from home and ate it at his desk. He took the stairs when the building had them. He listened to what a place sounded like before he decided what it was. He had learned something in 26 years of building companies that he had stopped trying to put in a report. The true character of an organization is never in the quarterly number. It lives in the small, unguarded decisions. The moment someone chooses to walk the 4 steps to the table, the moment someone chooses to speak instead of calculate, the moment a room decides that the truth is worth the cost of being wrong about who was holding it. Those moments are always being recorded, even when no one in the room believes that anyone who matters is watching.